standards and new technologies uh, in a vendor neutral environment. We do not promote anyone. We have a very close partner, which is the India Internet Engineering Society. They are based out of India. It is founded by a group of engineers from India as well as from the diaspora to expand Indian participation at the IETF and other standards bodies. So we've had a number of webinar series with INTC, multi-year IPv6 deployment, and we actually are starting to see some deployment of IPv6 in particular in India. We've talked about security, and this series is new work at the IETF, and this is one of the things that Jason will be talking about. We've had a number of grants from both Aaron and AP Nick. Just a couple of words about me. I've been in the industry for a fair amount of time. I'm a product developer and specialize in IPv6 network management and cybersecurity kinds of things. Let's talk about Jason, though. Jason is Vice President of Technology and works with products and standards at Comcast. He leads Comcast's effort in new standards, and this is what one of the things is that certainly geolocation is very, very important to Comcast. Jason's been with Comcast for a number of years, instrumental in creating Xfinity Voice, home, and Wi-Fi. I'm sure many of you, in particular in the US, use those. I know I do. He's also on the IAB and was one of the chairs of this workshop. So on to Jason. Jason, I'm going to stop sharing. So if you will go ahead, we'll get started.
All right. I am just pulling up the slides. All righty. Thank you very much for having me. I am going to provide an overview of a recent IP geolocation workshop that the Internet Architecture Board conducted just a few months ago. We held it virtually in early December. We accepted 30 submissions, which are sort of like position papers, if you will. And we had 67 participants, which was a very large number. We were, quite pleased to see there was such wide interest in the topic. And each of those 3 days, it was held from the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th. We focused on different areas. The first day we focused really on the current use cases for publishing, discovering, and using IP geolocation data. The second day really dove into what were some of the points of friction or challenges, so areas of improvement, and some ways that we potentially could do some incremental improvement in IP geolocation and how that worked. And then the last day we focused on future directions. So what are some major changes that could happen related to geolocation? Could it be decoupled from IP addresses? Are there additional, privacy controls, and so on? So why did we end up talking about this as the IAB? One of the things that we found was, and I think all of us here probably know this intuitively, IP geolocation is used extensively on today's internet, and it's a core part of how things like CDN localization and a lot of other things work. However, IP addresses were really never designed with geographic meaning, right? So that, is sort of like a design mismatch, if you will. But like I said, it's ingrained to really, every activity that we undertake as an end user on the internet today. And so we wanted to dive into that to understand it a little bit more. And as we did, the first step, as I said, was understanding why is geolocation used associated with IP addresses. How is that being done today? There were a couple of big areas. One, and this is the primary one in a lot of cases that users think about, is how to optimize the user experience and the network behavior. So this may be to infer some language or regional settings, to identify relevant nearby content, and to optimize network routing and server selection. So just to touch on a couple of those in more detail, one of the examples people gave was you're doing a web search and you're searching for, pizza near me, pizza delivery. You want to get the pizza delivery for the city you're in. Maybe that's in Toronto, not in Mumbai if you're not in Mumbai. So that was a use case that was talked about, from an end user standpoint. And then also a big one is server selection. So thinking about it, in my role as an ISP, a network operator, we share IP geolocation with content providers like video streamers and CDNs. And they use that to look at the source IP address of a connection and then determine how to do dynamic DNS responses to direct people to the closest by network distance or regional distance destination. And that's used pretty extensively around the world. And then the other big category was enforcement. So there are examples of legal or compliance requirements, contractual requirements, and disaster relief or law enforcement. So to give a few examples, the IETF was recently in Shenzhen, China, and there were a few AI related sites that I and other participants were pulling up, and you would get a message, sorry, the service is not available in China. You can access it when you're back in your home country, for example. So that's an example where the source IP address, the inferred geolocation was used to say, hey, sorry, we as an operator are not licensed to provide the service in a particular market. Another one, which is one that people see perhaps a little bit more often, is around the licensing of video streaming content. So if you are a movie studio and you create, and you've got some producers and directors and actors and whatever that create a movie, each one of those movies or TV shows has entirely unique geographic distribution agreements. So in the United States, they may decide, okay, we're going to license this for distribution via Netflix. In the EU, it's going to be via, Sky. In South America, it's going to be on YouTube TV or something like this. And so from a streaming destination standpoint, they will also do a country by country kind of look. And there's lots of other examples of those, kinds of things across different areas of content. Whether it's effective or not, or completely accurate or not, is less a factor because it's used extensively. And that's what we did in this part, was to understand why is it used, how is it used, not necessarily is it the best solution. And then we dove into what are the current mechanisms for sharing geolocation data if you're a network operator that owns or manages a lot of IP addresses. And there are really two key RFCs, one that defines a comma separated value format for geofeeds, and then the other which talks about how to discover those feeds and authenticate that they're in fact valid and tied to the owner of those IP blocks in a similar way that you would use RPKI to trust route updates, for example. The challenge with 8805 in particular is that not everybody wanted to use CSVs. So the Streaming Video Technology Association and a lot of the members of that org standardized it on a JSON format. And some ISPs are using sort of either a JSON or a CSV, but not quite in the format that 8805 defines. So there's a lot of variety in the way that network operators publish these, and a lot of variety in the way that if you're a list operator, like a MaxMind, for example, how you discover those and consume them. And those providers, MaxMind, IP Info, and there's lots of others. They have a lot of sort of value add or secret sauce, as it were, where not only do they consume these services, but they have lots of other metadata that they go out and find to try to increase confidence and trust in the data sources, to potentially override them or ignore some of the sources. And that's very bespoke and particular to all of those operators. And sometimes their pricing models for those feeds varies based upon that trust level or how up to date it is, for example. Um, and one of the big problems that we found is related to low Earth orbit services, Starlink being the primary example here, really the only one that's launched right now, where a single IP address doesn't necessarily map to a single location. And that location associated with that IP, even if that's a ground station, could represent lots of different geographies. And so, that those sorts of services bring some unique challenges. Similarly, networks that are using carrier grade NAT may be doing a lot of geographic aggregation, and so on. So some of these, you can see some of these mechanisms beginning to sort of break down or experiencing some challenges. So what does IP geolocation represent? Lots of claims, whether they're valid or not. The folks that came, talked about, well, it could be an indicator of physical location of a user, or maybe it's used to indicate where somebody is from a network standpoint. You could look at a source, derive an ASN, try to understand where that ASN is going to egress from an interconnect standpoint. It could represent where network infrastructure is, like a data center, or it could represent a regulatory jurisdiction, a state or a country, et cetera. So it can mean lots of different things to lots of different people, whether or not that's accurate. So in terms of gaps and issues, we cataloged a whole lot of these, and you can of course take a look at the workshop report that's currently in draft form out there, and that'll eventually become an RFC. Lots of privacy and security issues. Certainly it's a location signal that's being conveyed or being inferred without really, an opt-in or an agreement by an end user. It can be used for targeting and tracking. Although as we dove into that, we found that given how imperfect IP geolocation is in comparison, in the browser, being able to do browser fingerprinting to track user interactions when they are authenticated to that site, or to use mobile GPS and handset-based location. Those are all far, far more detailed, and those have varying levels of consent, of course. And then, as I mentioned in the prior slide, a bunch of issues with the geofeed format, differences between whether people are using JSON or CSV, the format of the fields within those files that they're using, how extensible those are, et cetera. Lots of issues to be solved there. And I suspect that the main author of that is Warren Kumari, who's one of my fellow IAB members. I suspect he'll be working on an update of 8805 to try to extend it and fix some of these issues. And then, of course, deployment and ecosystem issues. There are lots of examples where these feeds, geofeeds get updated, and it takes weeks or months even for them to be updated by some of the list providers. A classic example that is always sort of amusing to IETF participants is the IETF owns its own IP block, but moves to a different physical location 3 times a year. And oftentimes there's lots of services on the first day or 2 of an IETF meeting that still think that the users are in the prior meeting location, because some of those destinations have not updated their location information. Or it's a case that they did see the location change, but until they see sustained traffic from that location, they don't update the data that they have. And then, of course, lots of location issues when a region or country is inferred incorrectly, or when people are near a border between those regions. If you think about you're in northern Vermont near the Canadian border, sometimes you get, Canadian, video streaming content in some of your feeds versus US ones. So in terms of changes, why are people discussing change at the meeting? There were lots of gaps that were discussed, not just in the formatting, but in how those were consumed and discovered. Um, we also spent a bunch of time with different participants diving into the Leo use case with Starlink and how those and privacy proxies. So think about mask servers or things like Apple Private Relay or the equivalents in the Google and Firefox ecosystems. A lot of those things are stretching the current model or are showing where there's people getting aggregated out of certain egress locations, and that isn't necessarily where they are located. And so some of these old assumptions are starting to fray a bit. There are also, new regulatory requirements. They're adding pressure for accuracy. You can see things like age verification being tied to particular jurisdictions. In the US, for example, down to the state level. Certainly, there's individual countries, Australia and others, contemplating legislation in this area. So, location is important for application services to be able to reliably identify for compliance purposes. And then finally, the bar for security and privacy keeps increasing. And so, having the ability to have some level of user awareness and consent built into the mechanisms is something that's typical of newer standards. So, in terms of the direction of change, as I mentioned, working on improving those geofeed formats and the ways that geofeeds are discovered are important steps. And then examining mechanisms that might not use IP address, but might use information passed in a web session or other protocols, other application protocols that allow for a higher level of authentication and sort of user consent or user participation in that location sharing. And there were some proposals that you can see that are linked in the workshop report to some thinking around what some of those mechanisms might be. And then, of course, we concluded that as much as people might like IP geolocation to go away, it's not. And so there are things we can do to improve and optimize the current system while also working on alternatives that might work better for the future. Next steps, always, the ITF and IAB always enjoy more collaboration. We were really happy that a very large percent of the participants were not typical IETF attendees. And so that's a great sign and a great, group of new folks to bring in and involve in the work. So as some of the new internet drafts come out around either optimizations of the existing IP geolocation types of things or new mechanisms come, we have a pool of participants that we can involve. And we encourage, lots of diverse network operators and application destinations to become involved as well, because they are sharing geolocation information and they want it to be accurate for their users, etc. And that is it. I'm happy to take questions and talk a little bit more.
Perfect. Let me see. Do people have questions? Please feel free to put it into the chat window, and then I will ask. Meanwhile, I will go ahead and take the opportunity to ask one of my questions. I was just recently at a quantum computing seminar. I am very into. What can I say? I get obsessed with things sometimes, if you will. uh, an IETF trait. So one of the things that I've heard, which is coming sooner rather than later, is replacement of GPS by very accurate quantum sensors. This is certainly transformational in many ways. What are your thoughts on this kind of thing? I mean, it leads to certainly many issues if I've got a quantum chip in my phone. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly one of the issues that we talked about. The as we talked about privacy and sort of detailed location, it was clear that what you get from an IP address is fairly coarse. It's generally not down to the street address level. But what we have in mobile phones today and what we're going to have in the future tells you very, very precise, within a few meters, can tell you vertically where you are in a building and sort of horizontally, okay, you're on like the third floor and you're at a certain location. And so, it's important for, handset vendors to, have privacy controls there. And they certainly do. But, we talked about some interesting cases where the user might consent to location sharing because maybe they're using a weather app, but they don't know that behind the scenes that weather app has embedded some SDKs from other providers, and they're sharing that location out to some third parties that are using it for something the user may not have anticipated. So it gets complicated.
100%. Yes. No, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions in the chat. So let me go ahead and go on to those. So is geolocation information more accurate, reliable, etc., for V4 versus V6, or alternately?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly, and we didn't dive into it in too much detail in the workshop. But I can tell you, as a network operator, my experience would say that IPv6 should be more accurate because of how much NAT, like carrier grade NAT, is going on for IPv4, where you have such a limited and finite pool of V4 addresses, and therefore you have to share them across a large user population. And so, in theory, that should mean that there's so much more V6, and therefore it's probably more accurate. But hard to say. No data in that area that I have. I'm sure someone has researched that, or should, and then submit a paper to SIGCOM or who knows what.
Now, interestingly enough, I'll share some of my thoughts on there because I've been doing a little bit of research into this area. It turns out many end user organizations, I'm talking about the enterprises of the world, who are not running, they may be running their own IPv4 ASN, but they lack sufficient expertise in IPv6. So they're letting, the Cloudflares and Akamai's of the
Interesting.
world. Does that, yeah, you see what I'm saying? And so
Yeah.
hence you what you go and geolocate to is Akamai, or
Right.
what what I'm saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting. And I'll see if I can write a paper on this in my copious spare time. Um, so a couple of other questions. Let me do this. So let me get it into what would IP geolocation going away mean exactly?
Yeah. I guess first I would say is I don't see it going away anytime soon in my career. But if it were to go away, it would have to be replaced by something else. So we can already see, if you ignore, let's say, the web, and you think about the application ecosystem in Android and iOS, you can already see that GPS data from your handset has really supplanted IP addresses from a location standpoint. And so, that's one of those alternatives. Some of the participants in the workshop talked about mechanisms where, during, for example, an HTTP session, if you were using the web, for example, or applications that use HTTP, you could potentially exchange a location token or something like this in the protocol exchange back and forth. So, that may be one of those. And, part of the workshop was trying to spur some of those ideas.
So to focus back on the handset and GPS on the handset. So are commercial providers such as MaxMind, IP Info, etc., doing anything? Or is the IETF working on any kind of standardization of said GPS location
Yeah, the
or
ITF is
IP?
is not currently, and rather than thinking of it from the perspective of an IP geolocation list provider, I would say approach it from the perspective of you're a destination. Let's say you're you're Google.com or you're Netflix or you're whatever edge destination. You have a need to know where is someone located to provide a better user experience, to provide the appropriate content, and so on. And if you are relying on, let's say, a native app that's embedded and installed in iOS, you're going to want to rely on that most detailed indicator, which is going to be out of the handset. If you don't have that, and it's someone in a web browser session or in a Mac OS or Windows, application or a smart TV, then you're going to have to fall back to other mechanisms that are less reliable, more coarse, like IP addresses. In which case, then you're going to one of these list providers and trying to get that data, or you're building it on your own. So it kind of depends, what, as the application developer, how the user is sort of coming in your front door, so to speak.
That's very interesting. I mean, I can see something like a layer two addition, or like a layer 2.5, like ARP or neighbor discovery.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Passing some of this data. Very, very interesting area. So let me go back to the questions
Yep.
and stop blabbering myself.
Yeah.
So, what are digital sinkholes in IP geolocation? Let me see if I can get that entire answer. And how does, well, these are two questions. And how does IP geolocation influence CDN routing decisions?
Yeah. Well, I think I might know what a digital sinkhole is, and I'll try to answer it assuming that I have this correct. But there are a bunch of weird cases, and some of them have hit the press where, a particular IP address just sort of gets assigned to a location. So that might be in the middle of a cornfield or the middle of the country. And so there are really funny examples, probably not to the person that lives at those addresses, where they get a bunch of contact. And it's like, well, your IP address, this thing geolocated and said my device is here or my package or whatever. But getting back to the bigger question about content delivery networks. So the way that usually works, and not always, but usually, is let's say you're a big CDN and a website comes to you and says, I want you to distribute my content. You, as that website, are going to delegate some of your authoritative DNS zones to that CDN. And that CDN then is in charge of crafting a dynamic authoritative response when someone looks up the DNS name for your site. So let's say, it's, whatever, video.example.com. And to use my network's example, somebody in Philadelphia types into their browser, that video.example.com. The authoritative DNS server that's being run by the CDN sees that and is able to infer the source IP address or the network source of that user. And then they craft a decision based upon some distribution fabric they have that says, okay, that user's in Philadelphia. I have a CDN node that is also in Philadelphia. I'm going to craft a dynamic DNS response that gives them an FQDN and then an IP address that sends them to that local content that happens to be using a direct network connection to get there instead of through transit. And so that happens all the time in the background with third-party CDNs. And so that's generally, how that works. And sometimes it is wrong. And so, for example, as an ISP, sometimes we may change our DHCP pools and we are moving a block of IPv4 addresses from, let's say, Minneapolis, Minnesota to Dallas, Texas. And for some period of time, some of these sites that don't update in a while keep sending users to CDN locations that are not optimized, that are further away from that Texas location where they are. So that's how it works at a high level right now.
Very interesting. Actually, so for the person who asked this question, I'm going to also point you to a session which should be up on the INTC website. We had Igor Lubashev from I believe he's with Akamai, talking about CDN routing and any cast addresses and the various options that there are. So I'm going to point you to Igor's session if you want to know more about that. Very, very interesting. And we could certainly do. We will be sending out a survey, folks, after this. And if there's any topic that you would like more information on, then please do point that out, because we can certainly get other folks to do this. It's a very interesting area. There's a little bit of a controversy over what is the right way to do this exact CDN routing business.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so let me continue on. We're fortunate to have a little bit more time for questions, which is a great thing. So you had mentioned getting more stakeholders involved beyond the usual IETF attendees. So who are you specifically speaking of? Enterprises or other folks, or who?
Yeah, the biggest block of new attendees were the IP address, companies, that the sort of, the information companies, the geo IP feed providers, as well as some destination networks, in particular like Starlink, that are on sort of bleeding edge of seeing the problems with geolocation information for their users. So it sort of those two segments. Not yet enterprises, although I just talked to somebody that runs some network user groups for North America-based network operators and network users, which are mostly enterprises. So I think that's probably another group, and certainly they care about geolocation as well.
No, absolutely. And there is a question asking about your recommendations for one or two websites for geolocation. And unfortunately, I'm going to take that. I certainly understand the concern. I'm going to take that off the table. We are a nonprofit organization, and we cannot be seen to take any positions on any particular vendor.
I mean, I would say, look at our workshop report, which I had linked to, and you can certainly share that link in the chat if you'd like. That's got links out to all the research papers and presentations that people provided, so that's informative.
Yeah, absolutely. It's public information. So that is to the gentleman who asked that question. So there is another question about, can you speak to things like internet relay chat and distributed social media, like Mastodon or Blue Sky, and I guess how this whole geolocation business interacts there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer for it, to be honest. Those are interesting sites in the way they distribute content, but I'm not sure where the convergence is from an IP geolocation information standpoint.
Yeah, no, that's great. And in fact, to the young lady who asked that question, I'm going to suggest to throw it back to her and say she should write a paper. She should do the investigation. I happen to know this. She's a very smart young doctoral, a new PhD. Yeah,
awesome.
Let her do it. So I think we're at the end of our questions. So the next steps, will we have a potential BOF working group? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I suspect that once the geolocation report is finalized, which should probably be in a month or so, because it's in the final review at the IAB, and then it goes to sort of community last call, that Warren Kumari and others that did 8805 to define the CSV format. We'll start working on an extension of that to cover JSON and some additional fields and so on. But there were a bunch of entirely new mechanisms that were discussed. So I'm hopeful that some of those might get what we would say is dispatched, go to Gen Dispatch, and that's where a new idea goes. And then they decide, is there an existing working group it can go to, or does it need to be a buff? And I think that's personally from my standpoint, because I'm very pragmatic, my preference would be that individual ideas come up, go to Gen Dispatch and get sent to an existing working group or just get carried in the Gen area, because a lot of times when a BOF is involved, you spend so much time on the sort of administrative aspects of forming a group, getting it to come together, and that can take 6, 9, 12 months or more to do. And that makes sense for entirely new protocol suites, but this is a fairly small topic and issue compared to the scope of a lot of new working groups. So I'm hopeful, just as a sort of pragmatist, that it can be done without setting up a BOF and a new working group, but one never knows. We'll see.
Yeah, you possibly a subset, somehow break into an existing working group and
Yeah.
do no, that certainly would make it faster. So while we were talking, a couple of other questions came in. That's
Yeah,
great.
of course.
Yeah. And so one, I'm not quite sure. I can't see the exact question, but I think it has to do with can one change the geolocation information that is shown or shared? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Each of the major list providers have a mechanism whereby they can say, oh, I want to provide a correction to this. But that's sort of a band-aid. I think the long term is look at the discovery and publishing mechanism, see if you own your ASN, for example, you own your blocks from your RIR, like an Aaron or a ripe, you should be able to publish the information yourself directly in one of these kind of feeds. And that's the best way to do it, rather than try to find and fix the accuracy with each of those providers.
Yeah, so whoever asked that question, if I didn't get it quite correct, somehow I'm having trouble with that chat window. Please put
Shall
it
I
into the
shall I
question
read it
window
out?
again.
Hi, Nalini. Shall I read out
Yes,
that question?
yes, please. Thank you, Mohit.
Okay, right. So the question, Jason, is how to change the geolocation which is showing from the ISP location where the IP is purchased to the client residing region or area.
So this is where, let's say somebody else owns the ASN, owns the block, and then they've delegated the block to a subset of that ASN to somebody else.
Mohit, is that the?
No, I mean, there was
Yeah,
a question by one of the participants. Yeah.
yeah, I think in that case, best to work with the owner of the IP blocks to get them to publish, a subset of that, sort of a more local block of IP addresses, and allow, setting of location, for that subset.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So one more. So this is this is from an enterprise point of view. As much as the IP as the IETF would like to think that enterprises are going to IPv6, it does not appear to be happening. In particular, internally, many enterprises have pretty much zero IPv6 internally, possibly some for their websites. So looking ahead, a lot of this stuff is being accomplished by more and more cascading nets, in particular for containers, this, that, and the other carrying on. And so so how do you see the IP geolocation working there? Which is an interesting question, because really we're talking about internal networks. So that's a different question, right?
Yeah, those enterprises still have an interest in having, accurate location information for their users in the enterprise, just as an, ISP would.
Yep.
But Yeah, the NAT does certainly complicate things. And, a lot of enterprise networks that may aggregate through pretty large scale NATs in just a few egress locations, that's an issue. And I think that just really points out the challenge of trying to reliably infer location data from IP addresses, right? Which is the point of friction of where we're seeing this model break. And so I think it's an example of, better to be solved with a newer mechanism, because that large scale NAT aggregation, in a select number of locations or spread across many locations with the same shared IP addresses, if Anycast is used or something like this, it just gets complicated and doesn't work very well. So, it's a good example, a good use case of some of these future mechanisms, perhaps, that are not IP based.
Yes, and I was very much, at first, I was very against non-IP based mechanisms, just because the situation today is what is being done.
Yeah.
That is what is
Yeah.
being done.
Yeah.
And it's a major switch. Having said that, embedding a little GPS chip, in particular, if it's quantum based, something like that, that really just makes a huge amount of sense. And I do see that it's like, because now I'm designing that app in my head as we're
Mhm.
talking. I think that it really, in the next 5 years, that really has to be the way we go. And I'm just going to give a little plug to an upcoming session that we're working on right now, in particular on quantum sensors. INTC intends to have a quantum day where we will be talking about things like this, which are very, very soon to be commercially available. So we're not talking 5 years from now. We're talking about things that are heading into commercialization. So, having given that plug, so you've got so many questions. How does VPN impact geolocation? And can you talk about V4 versus V6 and spanning regulatory boundaries?
Yeah, it is certainly an issue in terms of VPNs. And we talked about lots of cases where users are actively using VPNs to change their locations so that they can access different video content. And a classic example might be, somebody that is in Canada or the US, but wants to watch some cricket matches back in, India or Pakistan or something like this. And the way they're going to try to do that is get a VPN that gives them an exit node in one of those countries so they can see the content. And so, you can see that users know how to work that system. And, it's clearly an issue. And, when I travel, to use a different example for enterprise users, to an ITF meeting, and I use my VPN to get back from, say, Shenzhen to the US, then suddenly everything gets localized to the US, whether that's, what I want or not. So it can complicate things.
Yes, absolutely, and anonymous proxies really
Mm.
fall into that same vein as well. It's a slightly different, but yes, okay, great. This is an interesting question. Well, let me add on to that. There's another person talking about Firefox, and I believe they're talking really about all the privacy
Yeah,
mechanisms.
for sure.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what they mean. So, you have the examples, and under the covers, behind the scenes, so to speak, they're all generally using things like MASC, which is an ITF protocol, or oblivious HTTP. And so these are, these privacy protecting proxies, usually one or two layers of obfuscation between the user and the destination. Chrome, has, one that you can use through Google. Firefox has one. Apple has one in iOS. I think there's one in Android. So a lot of different flavors of this. And for sure, that was one of the areas where we talked about in this workshop that is a source of one of these challenges, where it's breaking the model of, IP geolocation, because that user's exit node out of those privacy proxies is not a reliable indicator anymore of where they're actually located. And part of that is by design of the protocols themselves to try to break the ability to tie a user to an IP address. But yeah.
Well, so the person responded again, and what they were saying is that apparently Firefox has a button which offers free VPN
You
right in
bet.
the browser.
You bet.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a new service. Yeah.
yeah, great.
Yeah.
Huh, th- this is an interesting. I'm not quite sure I understand this question. So whoever did it, maybe they want to answer something else. The question is: should IP geolocation mechanisms be standardized globally, or should they remain decentralized across providers? I'm not
Well,
quite sure
I
what that.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, I think what we have today is where there is some extent of standardization, but we have a lot of other people doing lots of bespoke stuff, and then lots of
Mm.
people doing bespoke aggregation of the data. And so I think it indicates that there's, a gap if we say, okay, we're going to live within the existing framework of IP geolocation for a while, so let's optimize it. That says we want to better standardize the format of how that stuff is published, and possibly enhance how they're discovered. But that discovery seems to work okay right now. And so, yes, I think there's a need for some, further standardization, and also for some of the newer mechanisms that are discussed. However, I think one of the benefits, or one of the things that makes different ITF protocols work well, is that the implementation and usage of that is all decentralized. So there's not some central gatekeeper for all IP geo feeds that is going to be anointed by an ITF standard. Rather, the standard is things like, okay, you get an IP block from an RAR, and you're publishing information about, for example, how you should trust route updates associated with those IPs, for maybe the geolocation for those IPs. And then, that is done on a completely, sort of distributed basis by the people that are using that. In the same way that people, you have DNS records that are standardized in the way that they're published and the way that they're queried, but the people publishing DNS records, that's done on a completely decentralized basis. So I think a similar model works here.
Yes, yes. And people should definitely go to protocolpolice.com if they wish to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Had to get that in.
Yeah.
um, so I'm getting obsessed with layer two information contained. So let's say that we did want to make some additions to layer two. Things would have to change quite a bit. And would
Mhm.
IETF be the one that would standardize any changes to a layer two protocol?
Probably not. I think ITF likes to start at layer 3. So it would be down to,
I triple
3GPP and IEEE and all those other providers.
Perfect. Okay,
Yeah.
so thank you so much,
You bet. My
Jason.
pleasure.
Any other questions or thoughts? Please do tell us, and then remember to follow us on LinkedIn. We will
Yep.
be sending Yes, we will be sending out more information. And as I say, look forward to our Quantum Day sessions coming soon. We will be announcing that in the future. And any other thoughts on presentations or topics you would like to see covered, please do answer the survey. And thank you all so much, in particular, Jason. Okay, bye bye.